Hey there, Chris DeLeon of HomeTeamGameDev.com, and this is the video in rotation. We're talking about game development. In particular today, I'm actually going to talk less about Home Team and instead about some questions I got from Mr. Brian's game design classes through College and Career Advantage, which offers career technology education for Capistrano Unified School District. So I went to graduate school with Mr. Brian, so it's funny for me to say Mr. Brian out loud. But he's got some questions about my career path, about the viability of indie game development, about talking to potentially younger students earlier in their path about what that entails, what that looks like, what my own path has looked like. And I can't help but also factor in a little bit. I interview a whole bunch of other developers, over 200 developers I've spoken to through my podcast, through Indicate Alumni Program, through IGDA, through the kind of events that I run. So I'm always triangulating a bit about what other people are saying and doing since. Now, I've got a list of questions to go through here, so I'll kind of skim those, bounce back and forth. But it's going to involve a bit of bouncing around, including listing my background, introducing myself. So Chris DeLeon, these days I teach on the internet. That includes building games with people that I'm training. That's what I do at HomeTeamGameDev.com. It's a non-traditional approach. People around the world build freeware games together for practice on longer-term schedules. Think 6 weeks to 6 months each, several being made in parallel. And when people get stuck, me and my industry trainers help them out with what they're stuck on. So they run to a level design question, they schedule time with a level design trainer. Run to a game audio question, schedule time with their audio trainer. I help them specifically with technical game design, which is the intersection of programming and game design. Also includes small team production kind of challenges around different ways forward, why we might do one thing versus another, what are the trade-offs, resource complexity, that kind of thing. Programming, but not really deep engine architecture kind of questions. In terms of my background credentials, so this has been pretty zigzaggy. 1997, started making video games as a hobbyist. I was using C++ and assembly at the time. Didn't have any graphics libraries and stuff. Starting out, didn't have any mentorship, had really outdated books. And at the time, I started making remakes of classic DOS games, then contemporaneous DOS games, and arcade games that I liked, just to kind of get a feel for how different stuff worked. I did that for probably as a hobbyist about 8 years. Went off to Carnegie Mellon, got a computer science degree out there. While I was there, helped start a student club of people, and that was Game Creation Society, that's still operating to this day. Just get a bunch of other students together, build games for fun. At the time, I didn't really see it as a career yet. I didn't know how to navigate that. In the process, we had guest speakers for that group that led me to a connection that turned into an internship at Electronic Arts Los Angeles. And I then spent the next 3 summers out there, a little bit of time full-time, working on Boom Blocks and Medal of Honor Airborne as a technical game designer on console games. This would have been back in 2005 to 2007. Thereafter, I split from there, and that's something where it's not that I disliked any of the people. You hear some different stories, and obviously everybody works with different people at a giant company. There's a 9,000 employee company. This was a studio of hundreds of people in Los Angeles. I just decided that I liked smaller projects where I felt closer to what's going on, which helps speak to why I moved more the independent direction. And my first hop from there was actually a startup my friend Kurt was getting going. I was like the 4th hire. That company eventually became PopCap San Francisco, but at the time it was something building a site called Playcrafter.com. And what excited me about that, it was a place where people online could drag and drop and do some basic scripting stuff to build games without any sort of background. And there was a whole bunch of people building games together. We helped architect the engine for that. We helped do some moderation of the community, helped grow some of the features and design new characters, new elements for that. Eventually, the nature of a Silicon Valley startup, they had pressures to pivot. That company kind of focused in a different direction. I split at that point. I had been doing a bit of contract work. And this was my first real steps towards independence. Was before this point, I'd always been still working for somebody else. I'd always had a boss, a manager, someone else who I had to impress with my credentials. And certainly it did help that I had a strong computer science degree from a good college education. Without that, I would not probably have gotten my foot in the door, certainly not at the age that I was, into Electronic Arts as a technical game designer, and then into a startup as like 4th hire. That credential helped in a way that is hard to subtract out from I couldn't have skipped those and got there. That said, it's a little bit gray after that point where, so by this point, when I first did contract work, I was making a solar panel game to help a company with its advertising. And it sounds a little crass if it's not something you're into. But, I had a skill set. I knew how to program games. I'd made lots of small games. Company wanted to build something. And a way to think about this, right, when companies do branded stuff, and I've got friends who've made yogurt games as part of their career path and so on. And it's like, who does that? Well, people who need money. You have a set of skills. There's companies that have money. And at some point when they're making these kind of things, it's not even necessarily about, is it really driving massive sales directly from that? It can partly just be they want to look hip and cool. They want to be the yogurt company that has a video game. They want to be the auto dealership that has a golf game that helps get you a coupon for some savings as part of 4th of July or whatever. And that's opportunity. And so part of the thing you wind up seeing out of indie game developers, at the same time I was doing that, I was starting to also do some experimental gameplay stuff on the side, where every single night I just create a experimental prototype alone in the evenings outside when I was still doing a bit of the startup and I was kind of gradiating into that contract work and just building stuff to try out things. And part of what you see in the independent game scene is there's kind of a range of things that happen financially. And I've seen this among a bunch of my peers, and I kind of think I found the middle road, which is what I'm going to recommend the kind of most prudent way to go about it. I have a few indie friends, a very, very, very few, who have been very well rewarded by the market in terms of the kind of things that they built, the timing that they built it at, the audience they were able to reach, the connections they were able to manage through going to conferences and so on to make those connections, paid off very well for them, financially doing well. Vast majority of independent game developers I know fall into one of two other camps. One is where for many years they were basically burning through savings, where they weren't putting in towards savings. In fact, they're pulling out from savings just to kind of keep the lights on, to pay the rent, while investing on their personal project to release that to a market. And in many cases, that doesn't pay for itself. Certainly not the first title. When a studio is making money as a game company, it's rarely happening from one project. It's happening from an accumulation of many different projects every year, over iteration, over time, past titles having long tail, smaller sales adding up over time, leveraging those connections to do more things as a studio, to have more opportunity, to get more funding. And that's where in the middle ground, when you see a stable independent game developer, this includes a lot of independent game developers who are winning awards on stage at conferences. I also help with IndieCade. A lot of people are winning awards at IndieCade and so on. Quite often what's happening is on the side, just like I made a solar panel game, they're taking contract work. They're doing work for other studios that needs to be done. And it's not always credited. Like, I'm not in that solar panel game. My friend who did the Ogre game, he's not mentioned in it at all. And a lot of these studios on the side, they're doing executive training stuff. Sometimes they're fulfilling some sort of defense-related training contracts. Sometimes they're doing projects related to academia where some PhD students have a thing that they need to build for design reasons. They outsource that to somebody else who can manage that work. And that contract work is part of how people stay afloat. It takes some of the risk out because you can get paid up front on a quantified, known amount of time, and use what time you can on the side to work on the other things. And so when I say like companies that are doing their own thing, built it up for time, I just recently looked this up. Fall Guys released 119 games over the past 15 years. Before Mediatonic made Fall Guys, that was their background. I had made, I think, 47 games independently before Topple was a mobile game I did. And so it's actually the next phase of my career here. I've been doing the contract work. And my first independent game, it's actually questionable whether this qualifies as independent. I had a former Electronic Arts executive who had went off and founded an iPhone publisher. We'll talk about the publisher layer in a second. And they reached out to me to say, hey, are you open to doing some projects with us? They kind of pretty open spectrum of what they needed done. The iPhone was very new. This is back in 2008. And what we wound up doing was an enormously successful game for the publisher. And part of the nature of a publisher interaction is that they are trying to balance out the risk. And so if you think about it this way, and the same thing's true for book publishers, the same thing's true for music publishing and so on, the reality of many different creative projects is that many never earn back their costs. Not only are they not enormously profitable, many just never earn back their costs. That's the nature of creative risk. It's hard to say which songs, which books, which games are going to resonate. And part of what the publishing layer exists to try to do is to take some calculated bets so that the successes can more than pay off the costs of the bets that didn't pay off. And so the way those kind of arrangements work is that the publisher, in the agreements vary, but this is sometimes where we have independent companies. You might say, well, it's still independent if you have a publisher funding some stuff. And there's usually a gradient, right? Where it depends on the amount of creative control going on. It depends on, often those same companies are also doing other things outside of an individual project that is supported somehow by a publisher. Sometimes publishers anymore, they'll look for things that are basically already done, and they're looking to help quantify. They're hoping to support doing final testing. They're looking to help support localization. They're looking to support distribution and porting to different platforms and arranging different partnerships and things like that. But in those cases, it is another case where someone tries to keep their lights on by having a way to make sure that there's money guaranteed. And the way those arrangements tend to work with publishers is that if your game is not profitable, if it doesn't make back its costs, well, you had some money coming in for a while, and now you go find another thing to try. And meanwhile, if it is profitable, then what winds up happening is a sizable percentage, and this also varies as to how the negotiations work, wind up going to the publisher instead of, or certainly before, paying the developer directly, if that makes sense. And again, this is the nature of many different creative industries work this way, writing, music, and so on. So after having a game that did very well through the publisher, I decided to stop working with the publisher to go fully independent. And that was when I started making some smaller games. And this was, again, the nature of when I had a publisher backing a project, I had basically a budget I knew I could work with. I knew that I could at least safely work with this money set aside to pay an animator, to pay an artist, to pay a musician, to pay for custom sound effects, for paying an additional support person to help out with some debugging of the code. And those are things that when I'm doing truly independent projects and I did not have necessarily a sizable budget to set aside to invest in it, I started working on even smaller projects, typically more experimental. And another thing that comes up when you're trying to do independent games, especially at the kind of low budget end, is something that in business worlds referred to as red ocean, blue ocean marketing. And all that's about is that red ocean is things where their companies are slugging it out at things that are known quantities. They know that there's a customer for an FPS game set in a world war. They know that there are certain types of puzzle games that people just love to play, those match 3 games. That's red ocean. That means that to compete in that space, you need to be enormous, you need funding, you need time. You're kind of going toe-to-toe on polish of our game's going to be slightly better than theirs, so we're going to get all those customers on our high-priced products. Blue ocean, so-called because the water is untainted from warfare, is trying to figure out something that is kind of off their radar. They aren't doing this yet. They haven't realized, and depending on the era you're designing games at, these are things like when the Wii came out, even though that was really a AAA scale Nintendo-supported thing, seemed kind of blue ocean at the time of completely off the radar of Microsoft and Sony weren't even experimenting with the kind of things that Nintendo was doing on that platform. And that's where indies will often be thriving with something that is very, very different, much more experimental, much more emergent. Sometimes it's utilizing new technologies. A lot of the early VR prototyping was this kind of thing of people trying to experiment and explore, can we make something that could never have been made before because somehow it's unique to this hardware? And that's something I was able to take advantage of. When I was doing iPhone stuff, I made one of the first games where you could use the accelerometer to tilt, to use gravity, where you could use multi-touch to rotate things on a screen. And even though they can seem like a technological novelty, it was a design affordance that before didn't exist. You couldn't do that with a gamepad. You couldn't do that on a computer screen. You couldn't do it with a mouse. And so those are things that uniquely positioned us to explore a different design space that gave us some advantage as independent developers. At some point, I shifted out of making games myself, and I really wanted to focus on training other developers. That's kind of put me on the path that I'm on still to this day. This started actually back in 2009 when I first ran a company doing this also independently. And this also falls in the category of, again, kind of doing business independently and having learned from my lessons of doing it as an indie game developer. One of the things you figure out is that anytime you're accepting outside money, there is no free money. All money comes with giving up some control and ownership. And so if we take an example of when I worked with publishers, there are certain things where if they and I disagreed about how something should be, they got veto say. Or, I mean, the deal would fall apart, but basically it puts it in their hands because they're the ones with the purse strings, so to speak. They sign the checks. They decide what is or isn't worth paying for. So you kind of have a boss, and that's where it feels less indie. For the business, this is a thing where when I started doing my training business, the way a typical business gets started is you raise funds somehow. You hit up angel investors through your family. If you have lucky enough to have those kind of connections, you try to build a case towards raising funds, or you might even just get a bank loan, kind of a business plan, and so on. One of the things that winds up happening, though, once again, is you wind up with these different pressures then if you can kind of keep a way to keep it low cost enough. And this is a thing that also you hear echoed throughout the independent games community. Jason Rower, who these days has had much more profitable games, but back then famously was making some extremely experimental artsy games. One of his strategies as an independent game developer is to keep his cost of living incredibly low. Incredibly, incredibly low. Very basic material needs was a pathway he had chosen to maximize his expressive freedom. And this is a thing, again, I did for years of my own stuff as well, where I was living very, very affordably to stretch out what runway I had in terms of what money I could invest in my own business in a way that wasn't burning through it too quickly. So I had time to build up my educational materials, so I had time to build up my approaches, so I had time to explore and experiment and organically grow my audience through mailing lists, through blogs, through podcasts, through YouTube videos, different kind of what we call content marketing, where you're putting out free content as a way to try to get eyeballs and attention so that when you have something to monetize, to sell, to deliver on in exchange for money, whether it's services, whether it's products, whether it's new games, you have a channel to do that where you're not having to pay for ads, where you're not having to shovel money in to a furnace, hoping it turns into customer sales. What this goes back to, when I started the training business, again, keeping the costs low, I didn't accept any outside funding. I was still doing teaching basically as an indie. If you think of like the university as the AAA teaching approach, where it's funded, it's a giant organization with lots of bureaucracy, I was very much on the other side, a very scrappy, soloing it, small teaming it, navigating weird, quirky, different ways to do it. That's still what I'm doing to this day. In the time in between, I went off to Georgia Tech for graduate school. That's where I met Mr. Brian. And this is a case where, at the time, I was doing research assistant stuff where I was taking some of my background as a game developer that had already been making games by this point for, I don't know, 15, 13 years or something. And was then helping professors with, they had needs for, they were doing experimental Connect projects they needed help with. They were doing some experimental stuff on the iPad they needed help with. They were doing some different kind of experimental animation systems, different kinds of games generation procedural stuff that I was able to help jump in on, lend a hand with, and that helped pay for my education while I was there. But one of the things that I've also figured out through talking to other indies and interviewing people for my podcast, and certainly was the case for me, was realizing that if you were, say, an indie musician, and there are some years where you are getting paid for your gigs enough that that's the main work you're doing. There's other times you probably have some sort of day job, may or may not really be related to music in some way. There's some years where we're giving lessons to pay for your costs. And these are all just a part of the big picture of what it means to be an independent musician who is self-funding what you're doing. And this has been true in my case as well, where that doesn't mean that you are not doing it. That's what doing it looks like. It looks like a mixture of contract work, sometimes finding a way to teach, sometimes finding different sort of things to do on the side, sometimes making some things that are business partnerships, so you can continue to have the actual freedom on the side to just explore and make things and do the stuff in the way that you want to express your voice in it. And independent anymore does mean a wider range of things. Arguably, there's enormous companies that formerly, I guess now they're part of a bigger organization, but formerly stuff like even Double Fine with Tim Schafer, arguably was indie by some definition. Some people would call something like what Demiurge chooses to be indie by some definition. The word sort of is broken down in many ways. There's indies who have lots of money and funding and public visibility. There's indies who are basically students who are just trying to find their footing, and everywhere in between. I find an important distinction to make, and where this confusion happens. Some people are like, what's AAA, what's indie? And where people tend to use AAA, of course, for giant studios, your Ubisoft, your Activision, your Electronic Arts, and indie, again, kind of seems like it might include everything. To me, the important distinction is that there's plenty of things that aren't either. Right? Those are two ends of a bell curve. We do not need everything to be indie or AAA. AAA can be things that are budgets over, I don't know, tens of millions of dollars per project. And on the other end, indie we can keep it meaning like not just independent of a publisher, but we can keep it meaning small team, probably helping self-fund what they're doing through somehow. And everywhere in between, there's plenty of other things that are game companies. They're game studios. It's a business. It doesn't have to be either one of those. So I think about what does indie mean and what has it been for me? It has been something where I maintain creative control, but I do that partly by balancing and juggling other kinds of work on top of the game making. So any given every given year, I'm still releasing 4 or 5 games a year. Some of those are commercial related. Some of those are contract work. Some of those are academic things. Some of those are stuff I'm not credited for as part of how that business arrangement works. But outside of that, I'm doing other things that help support that work. And that is, in many times, what indie looks like if you're doing it sustainably, which increasingly is important because, like I say, I've got some folks I know who basically burn through their savings without any sort of plan for how to do contract work, without having any kind of idea for how to make those connections to fund their projects by giving up a fraction of their time, a ratio of their time to be able to keep money coming in somehow. And so one of our trainers in Home Team Game Dev, one of our career trainers for specifically Independent Pathways, Jake Burkett out in the United Kingdom, he's got this nice graph for maybe the past 15, 20 years or so of the percentage of his work that was money coming in from outside business he did, where he's working for somebody else, doing somebody else's contract work, or for a while early on might have been a day job, and how that ratio changed over time as more and more of it became his projects that he had created, that he profited 100% from, or, sans taxes and overhead and those other kind of things. The other part that also comes from this is when you're operating independently, you have to learn some different kind of skills in terms of self-managing your own work. You no longer have a boss telling you what to do and when. You have to become that boss. It's a different set of skills not everybody loves, but it's part of the work. It becomes a matter of also being at sort of on the hook for bad decisions. And early on, when I was spending a little bit of time off and on in AAA game development, I remember thinking how many people there aren't really getting their say on these projects. And like, I've met people who've been in games for maybe 3.5 decades who will tell you straight up they've kind of had creative input on like 2 projects in their whole career that they feel in any way, shape, or form express themselves or whatever. They don't even necessarily object to that. It's just the nature of these projects with hundreds of people on them. And I didn't really relate to that because I had got into it when I was younger. It's just I wanted to make games. I had ideas for games. I wanted to make my game my way. That was an important part to me that kept pulling me back in this direction. But I met a person, and his story was that, like in high school, he didn't actually care to be a performer in the play for theater class. He didn't want to be out there singing and saying lines. He didn't want to be doing the lights. He didn't want to be doing the music. He didn't want to be directing. He wanted to be the person who put on, the all dark clothes, ran on between scenes, rearranged the furniture exactly as instructed, and ran off. He was just part of the support crew. And he liked being a part of something bigger than himself and not stressing at all about, did he make the right decision? And that's still to this day what he does as a deep back-end engineer working on making sure that the multiplayer systems never collapse for these giant AAA multiplayer games. He's writing code. His name barely ever comes up. He doesn't get interviewed for stuff. He doesn't talk about his work. People don't recognize him on the street or something. But he keeps those game servers running. And he likes that he goes home at the end of the day and sleeps and gets paid well, regardless of, was that the right game to make? Was that the right character choice? Was that the right level design? Was that the right platform? It's not his problem to worry about. He goes to work, does what's asked of him, solves the problems that come up, goes home happy. And so there's a personality type for that. The other side is where I'm at of, I want it to matter if the thing that I'm making and how I'm making, I want that constant kind of feedback, that close response from the marketplace of what I'm doing. Or if I'm doing creative free-form projects that are freeware, then I want the freedom and flexibility to do that without having to do it on somebody else's sort of vision or direction. So that's another part of it. The other last bit to this, let's see, pros and cons to career path. Let me make sure I didn't miss anything here from what it's like to do indie game dev, pros and cons. Speaking of which, and so this is also where a number of these projects too, by my nature, I'm a level designer, was my work at AAA, also rapid digital prototyper. And what that specifically means is my expertise is partly in that I can get functionality working on a machine very, very, very fast. And so some of my like viral YouTube videos are me speed coding, where I'll just slam out a 70s game very, very quickly. And so like my work at big companies, which also includes, I did a stint for a summer at Will Wright's R&D company, Stupid Fun Club. It always feels silly to say that out loud. But my work in a lot of these bigger environments was basically somebody saying, hey, we have an idea. We're not sure if it's any fun. It sounds fun, but it's hard to tell until you can play it. How fast can you get this working on screen with a controller in your hands? And, that's where, to do it correctly, to write the code properly, to engineer and architect it so it's robust and scalable and performant and all these different important words for long-term engineering projects, that might take weeks to do. I'd find some way to get it up and working by like 3 p.m. that day. And I'd be like, don't ship this code, don't keep this code, don't build on this code, but I can get it working. And what that was actually a form of building to inform decision making. And so that's been an important part of my work as a rapid prototyper, is that I can get something working very, very, very quickly, even if it's doing lots of trade-off and cutting corners in a calculated way. I'm very aware of the trade-offs that I'm making in the process, but it helps inform a decision maker to look at that feature. And again, we did the same thing at EA on different teams, where they would look at the version of the feature I'd implemented, and they'd be based on that, should we throw more software engineering time from several higher paid engineers into trying to take this feature further and put it on device so it runs on the console? Or can we say, based on how this plays so far, like, nah, half a day was as much time we should have thrown at this. We got the information we needed. Well, another part of that from the indie side is that a lot of the games that I've released are really kind of, think of it as putting a fishing reel out in the water, feeling out where are the bites, where is their feedback, where are people actually playing, what are people liking. And this is something where some of my independent games, probably about a decade ago, that did well they sold well on iPad when I released a couple educational games for that and entertainment apps for that. One actually became a finalist at Indiecade. That's part of what linked me up to that organization, where I've since been a speaker organizer for 6 years. These days I'm the alumni lead for Indiecade. But the way I'd done that was I had built these prototypes every single night for like 7 consecutive months, just every single night making a playable prototype. It's called the Interaction Artist series. And what I did was I just looked at the web traffic on those prototypes, because they're all just free online, and figure out, where is traffic going? what are people posting other places? What are people blogging about? What are they linking into from social media? Back then, there was a thing called StumbleUpon. I also tracked the traffic off of. And I could see these spikes. And the spikes weren't even themselves huge numbers, but they were huge compared to the others. Does that make sense? I was just seeing that, okay, well, if this is getting 20 to 100x the visibility as my other projects, then something about that concept is resonating with people. And so then what I did was I took maybe the top 5, 10 of those. I shoved several more weeks of my own time and energy into making a more polished version, taking that concept further, cleaning it up, putting a tutorial or better menus around it, adding more features to it, testing it with people, releasing that. And those were games that did well. That would not have happened without that prototyping experiment of putting some things out there to see what people liked. And a bigger scale version of this, we made a freeware game back in grad school. So first there was a team of students I wasn't a part of, made a game called Vision by Proxy. That game became shown at E3 through Indiecade. They decided that wasn't enough justification on their freeware game to take it to another level. That's when they recruited me, swapped in another artist. Over the next 18 months, we made a game called we made Vision by Proxy 2nd Edition. That game got played by 7 million people relatively quickly, about half in Asia, about half in US and Europe. We decided based on that, okay, well, we should take this even further, because see, we're getting this feedback. Meanwhile, I was doing other games that weren't seeing those kind of numbers. Maybe they're seeing 100,000 players, 400,000 players, freeware stuff, but not in the millions. And so in that case, we doubled down even further. We got a team of probably, it might have been 15 people or so together, built a game, Vision by Proxy, that was even bigger. At that point, we had businesses approaching us for if we wanted to license our game, to put their logo in front of it, we wanted to put it on their platform, if we wanted to accept business offers to port it to other platforms and so on, which in that case, for a variety of circumstances, we declined. But that's another case of where oftentimes the work that an indie is doing involves, like, you can't necessarily predict what the market's going to do, but what you can kind of do is find ways to test it by putting out some prototypes or putting out some experiments, figure out what are people talking about, responding to, playing, and that can be your feedback to then take that further, to go back, make a deluxe version, put some more investment energy into it, put some more time into it, prioritize a little better, and that can help it transition from people who are just kind of, there for the concept into making it more palatable to a larger audience, people who could use a little more structure in the experience. Pros and cons, probably discussed that a little bit in there. It can be certainly less stable. That said, I did have this decision early on in my career where I was at the large company. I was talking to some people about trying to decide whether I should go off out of college and do my own thing, which obviously was risky, or stay at this big cushy job in the big company, which seemed safer. And one of my coworkers said, okay, yeah, in 5 years, this company is still going to be here pretty much like it is. In 10 years, nobody knows. And sure enough, that coworker was correct. That particular building I was in basically dried up. It used to be 2 whole buildings. Now it's like 1 or 2 stories of one building, of teams got shifted around, franchises got discontinued, certain platforms didn't get repicked up for the license and so on. And so a variety of circumstances, that the thing to realize, when those teams got downsized or shifted around, which happens in games all the time at every scale, it doesn't mean any of them did their job badly, right? It doesn't mean the level designer didn't do it right. It didn't mean the writer didn't do it well. It didn't mean that the character animator didn't do a good job. It just means that an enormous strategic decision has swept this entire thing off the map and relocated a whole bunch of people. When I'm smaller, when I'm doing my own business and I don't have as many salaries to cover, it's something where that agility is there, so I can much more adeptly keep up with things, and it is more flexible. It's not as fragile to, if there's a big strategic shift, everything disappears. And that's enabled me to, while my business might have pivoted, shifted, changed forms a little bit, reprioritized what I'm doing and how, that sort of thing again comes from the indie side in a way that it can seem like the big company is safer somehow. And I think that's actually an illusion. As an indie educator as well, right? There's been some advantages to teaching online as opposed to within an institution for some of the same kind of reasons. Let's see, any other stuff? I think that was kind of the main questions. I'm sure I've talked much longer than the planned time, but I wanted to kind of share plenty of notes there on the background stuff. The current group, Home Team Game Dev, has been running for 5 years. In the middle in there, when I was at Georgia Tech, I started another club out there, VG Dev, which is kind of inspired partly by the pattern from Carnegie Mellon's Game Creation Society from 2004. So Home Team Game Dev is sort of my third iteration on the formula. In the middle, I actually did another online prototype. Again, the nature of me is prototyping, which we created probably 8 games in a different online community. So a whole long circuitous history there, but I want to focus on the independent game development and not so much on the educator side. So I've tried to keep the focus there on the indie career arc stuff. And I'll also say that it changes shape over time. Like I said, it's something that for many people involves juggling different things. That's just what the work looks like. And this is also a story that in no way is unique to me in terms of lots of my other peers who I see everywhere when I'm going out to conferences, whether I'm at PAX, whether I'm at GDC, whether I'm at Siege, whether I'm at Indiecade, and being in industry as independent often involves going to these kind of things, finding ways to make the cost work, to meet people and maintain those connections. When I'm doing that, I meet lots of other people who also have these kind of very zigzaggy stories where they started kind of unconventionally. Everyone kind of started stories like, oh, it's weird how I got into it, because everyone gets into it weird. Bounces around a bit, some big company time, some maybe adjacent company time where it's related skills but not in games. Games that have taken different shapes, where some were formerly indie and less so, or vice versa. Some wind up in and out of teaching at different kinds. It's just the nature that it takes. And so being ready for continually learning and adapting is a necessary part of it. That's also true for games in general, even if you're at a bigger company, where every 5 or 10 years there's major shifts in terms of, I grew up playing arcade games. Those, of course, are largely gone. MMOs kind of came and went as a phase. Casual games kind of came and went as a phase. Mobile games kind of came and went as a phase. Lots of things happen in interesting ways, in a way that at some point at the big companies, the kind of games that they're making aren't often the same kind of games people who are working there grew up playing. And it's just the nature of a business that adapts and changes as rapidly as video game technology, that if you're going to have a long career arc in it and you're going to keep doing it, it's going to have to be lots of adaptation and experimentation. And that's probably enough for the day. I think I've probably hit the main points. Let me just double check that I didn't actually miss anything in there. I know there's kind of a lot I covered. And yeah, so again, thank Mr. Brian's game design classes through College and Career Advantage, offering career technology education at Capistrano Unified School District. Thanks for the question. And yeah, see you next time. Good luck out there.